All right, and now onto the final class that some people forget about because no one ever plays it these days, except for me, and I cry myself to sleep, Priest. So a lot of people were coming into the sort of Karazhan reveals being like, oh my god, they better have some awesome Priest cards. The class is doomed otherwise. And, well, the Priest cards are not awesome. They're good. I actually think that a lot of people are underestimating a couple of the Priest cards. I think people are underestimating all the Priest cards, frankly. They're good, but they're not, like, groundbreakingly amazing and don't really fill the roles that people feel like Priest needs. I think that the types of cards that Priest needs, and this is kind of going on a tangent that's not necessarily directly related to the cards here, in order to be competitive, we've seen, like, two types of competitive Priest decks, basically. Control Priest and Board Presence Priest, basically Dragon Priest. Those are the two primary types of Priest decks that have been successful in Hearthstone. And we've lost the two most important cards for those decks' success, which I think, one of them I think people kind of overlooked, which is Velen's Chosen. I think Velen's Chosen was the most important card for board presence-based Priest decks, pretty much that existed, because it allowed stuff like Whelp, Wormrest Agent, everything else to just sort of trade up, and Priest really wanted to be able to trade up and actually use its hero power and keep its minions relevant for a longer period of time, because that's Priest's power, is preserving its board. And without Velen's Chosen, you play your 2-drop, they play their 3-drop, and it's like, oh, well, I'm outclassed now, my hero power doesn't really do anything. When most minions trade, the hero power doesn't really matter. You need things that make your minions not trade. Powered Shield can only do so much because it doesn't actually allow your minions to attack up in many cases. So none of these cards do that. None of them are Velen's Chosen, none of them are Light Bomb. They don't let your board presence Priest deck continue to use its early minions later on in the game, and they don't let your control Priest deck clear the board. So we've got to figure out what we're doing. Regardless, I think the cards are actually good. I think the cards that Priests were given in this expansion, other than Purify, which is a weird case, I'll get to that in a bit, I think they're good. Priest of the Feast, let's start there. Priest of the Feast, I think it's actually a very powerful card. I think this is a card that doesn't read super exciting. You look at it and it doesn't seem awesome, but this card is great. This card is, I think, actually one of the more powerful class cards in this set. If you added Gain 3 Life to every single spell, that spell would in many cases just be bonkers, right? And this is a 3/6 for 4, which is very good stats for Priest in particular. Priest cares most about the health of its minions. It wants its minions to be able to be relevant in combat, and 3 attack and a 4-drop is relevant in combat. But it also is difficult to kill, and allows you to just preserve your own life total while you're interacting with your opponent's stuff with your other cards. Remember when I was talking about Moonglade Portal? And one of the most important things with like healing effects was that they do something else, that they aren't just healing. One of the problems that actually Priests have, which is sort of weird because Priest is supposed to be framed as like a healing class, it's actually not that good at keeping itself alive. It doesn't have things like Lay on Hands that are these great value style heal cards that Paladin has. It doesn't have Ragnaros Lightlord. It doesn't even have Forbidden Healing. Priest has like these cheap, efficient heal cards like Flash Heal or Light of the Naru, which are good only because they synergize with Akanai in some other matchups, but often can just sort of sit and rot in your hand. But you have to play them to be able to stay alive against something like Freeze Mage or Burn decks or whatever else. Priest of the Feast just kind of attaches that to everything. Every spell that you play, and Control Priest decks tend to play a lot of spells, it makes them all into things that gain you life. This is not only effective in terms of keeping you alive in long games against aggressive decks, or even short games against aggressive decks, frankly. Your aggressive opponent is beating you down, and you clear the board, and then you're like, okay, Priest of the Feast, Powered Shield it, Shadow of Pain your guy, and suddenly, you have a significant board presence and have gained a ton of life back. And then until your opponent kills a huge minion, not huge in terms of overall size, but like very high health minion in Priest of the Feast, which is a huge damage investment, you're going to keep getting out of range of their burn effects. This is a card that can potentially allow Priest decks to beat Freeze Mage, which was always like an absolute nightmare for a lot of Priest decks. But like they Alexstrasza you, and you just go, okay, Priest of the Feast, Powered Shield, this, I'm huge health now, and then like, okay, are they going to kill your Priest of the Feast? Probably not. They have limited burn. You can actually win those kind of matchups because this card is so effective at keeping you alive. Similarly, you can play against like a Doomhammer and just kill your opponent's guys and keep yourself alive out of range of the Doomhammer very easily with this card. So I think this is a great card. I think Priest of the Feast is the best Priest card in the set by a lot. Obviously, that's not saying a huge amount, but I think it's one of the best class cards overall in the set. As to whether it's enough to actually get Priest into a competitive realm, probably not. The core problems of Priest are sort of those that I mentioned before. It's like kind of a reactive class that doesn't have the tools to be proactive in the way that it needs because its minions can't really trade up, and it has very situational reactive cards that don't necessarily deal with all sorts of threats, and like your opponent makes a big board and you don't have Light Bomb anymore, and boom. But Priest of Fee is a great card, and I think that it is a step toward potentially making some styles of Priest viable in competitive play. Onyx Bishop. This is an interesting card because it's basically Resurrect attached to a 3/4. So, I know some people love to do their like math of, oh, well, if this is worth this and this is worth this. None of these things really work out necessarily because the combination of these things is worth more and less depending. But Onyx Bishop, one of the things that's important I think about Onyx Bishop is that, well, for one, you can play this and Resurrect in the same deck, and that's a big deal. The fact that you can get redundancy in effects, and we're going to talk about this later too, it makes the fact that you can play cards that are good with those effects more easily. You can play your Injured Blade Masters and Resurrects and Onyx Bishops, and you're more likely to get the effect of, hey, I get my Injured Blade Master back for free. But Onyx Bishop, I think, is better than Resurrect in a lot of ways because you don't necessarily just play it in like kind of a space turn. Because Resurrect's issue is that in order for Resurrect to be efficient, you have to Resurrect and use the rest of your mana to get like additional value out of it. It's like you play your Injured Blade Master on 3, it dies. You Resurrect it. It's like, actually, it's pretty great because you get a 4/7 because it comes into play without the Battlecry effect. But like, it's not this amazing value. Whereas with Onyx Bishop, you play the Onyx Bishop and you get the Resurrect effect because now you've actually spent mana and gotten this minion in play already, and you don't have to have something else to combo with it like you do Resurrect to get additional sort of tempo worth for your mana. Like you can easily just play Onyx Bishop on turn 5 after a 4-drop, maybe a Priest of the Feast, dies, and that's a lot of value you're getting. You don't have to have just the Resurrect plus some other card you had to draw in combination with it to get that sort of tempo effect. The fact that you just have the tempo effect attached to a 3/4 body, which, again, we need something to work with these bodies, these small bodies that Priest always ends up with. We need a Valence Chosen or something to make them better. I don't think Power Tentacles is it. The fact that that's just kind of naturally part of Onyx Bishop rather than something you need to draw with Resurrect to pair with it, it makes a big difference. So I think that Onyx Bishop has potential. I think that it is definitely an interesting card that can pair very well with things like Injured Blade Master. It also works very well with, say, Barnes. Barnes, it's a card we're going to come back to in a bit, but Barnes plus Onyx Bishop, say you Barnes and have a bunch of huge minions in your deck, you get a 1/1 copy of one, your opponent kills it, it's like, okay, well now I Onyx Bishop. My opponent killed my Ragnaros, that was 1/1, so now I Onyx Bishop and get a Ragnaros back. So I think that Barnes is actually, and its combination with Resurrect and Onyx Bishop is huge in terms of like potentially giving Priest this weird sort of engine thing that it can do. Granted, Barnes is a legendary and you can't really build a deck around doing that, but you can build a deck around other things that are good to Resurrect, like Injured Blade Master and such, and having multiple copies of that style of effect with both Onyx Bishop and Resurrect is a really big deal in terms of consistency. So I think this is a card that has a lot of potential, and I'm definitely going to be experimenting with decks that include it. As to whether those decks will be competitive in tournament play, their Priest will remain to be seen. And now last, and by most estimates certainly least, Purify. And now I want to come at this from a couple of different angles. One is, I think it's obvious that Purify is not a card which is a just jump out at you powerful competitive card. Gets pretty clearly true because most people just think it's terrible. But I think it's fine that every card isn't a top tier competitive card. It's in fact important that every card isn't a top tier competitive card. And I think that if Purify were a Shaman card, everyone would be okay with it. They'd be like, oh, this is a weird, wacky Shaman card. It's a Totemic Might or whatever. This is the sort of thing that it exists so that people can try and figure out what they can do with it and explore the possibilities and whatnot. The problem, I think, is that it's a card that is a Priest card at a time that Priest feels like it is really lacking in terms of competitive viability. And, Priest gets 3 cards in this adventure, and this is one of them. I think that it's fine that Purify exists. And I think that it is a card that I'm happy that it exists, actually. In some ways because I think that it's a cool card for people to try and figure out a puzzle of how to use it. And also because I think that it helps reinforce the sort of silence theme in Priest and enables redundancy in terms of decks that might want to silence their own minions. Priest has Herald Village. There's Barnes in this set. There's a lot of things that you can use with Priest to potentially sort of get advantage from silencing your own guys. You can have an Ancient Watcher, Eerie Statue, whatever priest deck, and I've actually seen a lot of people who are like, oh, someone tried like a silence priest deck, it wasn't any good, it was too inconsistent. It's like, well, it was too inconsistent, I'm sure in part because it only had access to a certain number of silence effects, and Purify gives it access to another silence effect, which increases its consistency, so maybe it will be better now. And I think that, it's the kind of card that I actually am interested in trying to explore decks that might use it. I don't think that it's likely that those decks will be like top tier competitive decks, but that's okay because, there should be a variety of things people can explore, and not all of them can be top tier competitive decks. But I think that I've seen people say like, oh, it should cost 0, it should cost 1. It's like, well, it has draw a card attached to it. And anything that has draw a card attached to it, it's dangerous when you make that kind of effect cheap. Because it just enables you to cycle through your deck and generate combinations of things and whatever else. Like, people might play Purify in their own deck with just one, silence your own guy draw card, just because it was basically just one draw card. Obviously, you'd have to have a guy in play, but like being able to silence whatever nonsense guy because you're just trying to cycle through, and that's an important consideration in Hearthstone for anything that says draw card. So I think that it's actually probably correct that it costs 2 as opposed to 1 in terms of that functionality. And I think that people are understating the possibility that it can be used effectively in some kinds of decks. But I am sympathetic to the point that, it is a weak card for a class that is already very weak. And that is, perceived to be a problem. But I think that it's important that Blizzard has the ability to like make funky cards for every class, no matter where their sort of perceived power is in the metagame ladder. And, because that appeals to a certain type of audience that isn't necessarily just the person who wants to make the top tier competitive deck. There might be someone who's like, oh yes, this is exactly what I needed because I wanted to make a deck that used Herald of Village and Eerie Statue and whatever else with silence effects. Like, so it gives them redundancy. And that's another important thing. Like, the redundancy is a very big deal for those sorts of things. The fact that maybe a self-silence priest deck didn't work before, fine, it probably wasn't good. It may not be good now, but it's going to be better because it has access to more of those effects, including one that happens to cantrip. I also want to kind of debunk some of what people have been saying about like adding mana cost together. Like, ooh, this with Ancient Watcher, it gives you a 4-cost 4/5. It's just a Chowan Yeti. It's like, well, it's a 4/5 that you totally spend 4 mana on over multiple turns that can attack as early as turn 3. It's a very big difference than, spending 4 mana on a 4/5. So I just think that it's important that people look at things in like the actual way that they exist and not in just like slamming numbers together, because that's not just really how things add up in Hearthstone. So, but anyway, I understand that people are upset about the state of Priest, and I don't think that the Priest cards in this set are necessarily the sort of things that Priest needs to be competitively viable. I do think Priest of the Feast is great. I do think Onyx Bishop has a lot of potential. Both that and Purify offer a lot of redundancy to themes that Priest have already, and might be able to build out to be more competitive. Onyx Bishop, certainly more than Purify. But anyway, I feel for you Priest fans out there. I'm a Priest fan myself, probably my most played class. I'm certainly going to keep fighting the good fight, and Priest of the Feast, I think, is the hero we need, or at least the hero we have right now. Maybe not the one we need. We'll see how well I can do. So, blessed be the funnel cake. Anyway, that is it for my thoughts on Karazhan. If you missed any of my previous reviews, be sure to check them out. And let me know what you think in the comments. Let me know where you think I'm right, where you think I'm wrong, where you think I'm totally crazy, and why you hate me because I don't hate Blizzard for printing Purify. Bye-bye.